St Mary's is one of 3 medieval churches that stood in the village of Barton, Bendish, on the edge of the Breckland area of Norfolk. 3 churches was a lot for one village, and in 1789 the central church, All Saints, was demolished. It was taken down, its building materials moved, and in fact its doorway reused as the west end of this church, which needed repair after a storm. The church is of the simplest possible construction. It's made up of just 2 parts, the chancel nearest us and the nave in the distance with a later bell turret. The window in the foreground dates from the decorated period. That's the early part of the 14th century, and in fact most of the doors and windows were replaced at that time. The church is thatched, a common building material in the medieval period, particularly in areas like this where there was very little available clay for tile. This doorway and window are extremely good examples of work of the 14th century, when the chancel was completely refitted. The church is built of flint rubble. Because the flints are oddly shaped, there's lots of mortar in the wall, and this can allow damp to penetrate the walls. And so to avoid this, the church was given a coat of lime wash. It's this yellowy material you see behind me. And it acts as a protection against the moisture and stops most of it penetrating the walls. Because the church is thatched, it has to have very deep eaves. There are no gutters, and so the water can be thrown off onto the churchyard. If you look above me, you'll see underneath the eaves just how deep they are. Here at the west end of the church, it's very easy to see the Romanesque doorway. And to all intents and purposes, it looks like it's been here forever. But as we know, it was only brought here in the 18th century. The doorway is made up of 2 main orders. On the inner edge, just above my head, you can see the bobbin shapes, which are very typical of the middle of the 12th century. But above them, towards the outside of the arch, you can see beakhead moulding. This is carved to show what looks like beaks' heads biting onto a circular moulding that rolls around the edge of the building. These are very common in work in, for example, the Cotswolds of the 12th century, but you also find them appearing here in rural Norfolk just a little bit later. The door still has its medieval closing ring on it. The interior of the church is very simple. Again, it's the 2 rectangular parts of chancel where we're standing and nave. It's obvious that there has been some rebuilding here over the centuries because we have blocked up arches everywhere. So this church was once very much larger, like the other 2 that existed in the centre of the village. Amongst other features in this church is this lovely Tudor doorway which leads into the vestry with these superb mouldings at either end, just finishing off the arch, a man and a woman. Behind me you can see the remains of the only wall painting to be left in this church. It's 14th century and shows the Wheel of Fortune. There are very few memorials in the church, but in the floor just in front of the door, which would have been in the centre of the church as first built, is a large plain slab. And we think this is the grave of the donor who paid for the nave to be rebuilt in the 14th century and who requested to be buried in its midst. The communion table is dated 1633, and it's absolutely typical of the period, very small, simple, and most importantly, made of wood. There is only one 18th century monument of note in the church, a ledger slab on the floor, now unfortunately covered by the Victorian altar rails. You can quite clearly see this lovely piece of design. One of the early guidebooks to this church said that it represented an octopus, but of course it's a skull with some laurel leaves. St Mary Barton Bendish is one of 3 medieval churches that formerly stood in this tiny Norfolk village. It may be a small building, but it gives us so many clues to the people who lived before and is well worth a visit.